Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we are continuing our all 32 NFL team previews for the 2023 fantasy football season. And today we are starting our tour in the NFC West with the defending NFC runners-up, the San Francisco 49ers. This one is a really interesting one because with all the injuries and acquisitions that this team made during the season, the splits for this team in terms of who was productive really varied based off of who was active and who wasn't. And so it's definitely going to change a lot of opinions when you look deeper at the numbers and just see who was good for fantasy when they were good at fantasy. So going to go over a lot of information in this episode about what the 49ers did in 2022 and then what you can expect in 2023 from the San Francisco 49ers from a dynasty, redraft, and best ball perspective all in one. Now, if you are new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button, whether you're listening to the audio or if you're on YouTube. It really does help me out a lot. If you're on YouTube, please hit the like button as well. It really does help me out a lot. I really do appreciate it. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about best ball on this episode. If you want to get in the best ball game, I recommend doing so on Underdog. You can use my promo code MConley88 to get your first deposit matched up to $100. Link is in the description on YouTube and it's pinned to my Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the preview. So even with all of the acquisitions and roster changes and injuries, the 49ers offense still just kept on ticking in 2022. They were still a very successful offense. They ranked 5th in the league in terms of yards per game, and they ranked 6th in the league in terms of points per game. Now, in terms of their play calling, they ranked 7th in rush rate, meaning that out of all the teams' play calling distributions, they had the 7th highest percentage of run plays called, meaning that if you inverted it for the pass rate, they would have finished 26th in total pass rate. Now, like I said, their offense differed a lot depending on who they had in the offense. They averaged 29.8 points per game after acquiring Christian McCaffrey compared to 20.3 points before. That 29.8 number, that would have ranked them top 5 in the league easily. I believe it would have placed them second behind the Buffalo Bills with that number. So definitely a much successful offense with McCaffrey. Also worth noting that the quarterbacks changed in both of those windows. They had Trey Lance and Jimmy G before McCaffrey, and then once they got McCaffrey, they had more Jimmy G and then Brock Purdy to end the season. Now, that kind of is a natural segue into discussing the quarterback position for the 49ers. So nobody in the NFL right now has more question marks as to who is going to start week 1 than the San Francisco 49ers because Trey Lance is recovering from an injury and Brock Purdy is recovering from an injury. And I, for one, don't know if either one of them is going to be healthy. I don't know which one they would choose if they were both healthy because Trey Lance obviously beat out Brock Purdy before week 1 last season, but Brock Purdy was obviously better. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't really want to bet on either of these guys right now in terms of drafting them in a season-long league. However, I do think that as time goes by, if we get any more clarity on the situation, this is a very lucrative position. 49ers quarterbacks last year, name like notwithstanding, like doesn't matter who it was, 49ers quarterbacks totaled 7 top 12 and 11 top 15 weekly finishes last year. They had a deceptively high floor and they were deceptively good fantasy options. I think that's something to remember in DFS this season once the season begins is that whoever is starting for this offense is in a very good position to succeed because of how successful it is. Now, Brock Purdy is the one that intrigues me the most. He averaged 18 fantasy points per game in games that he started, which would have been good for QB9 if he had kept up that same rate over a full season. So basically, Brock Purdy, if he is healthy and if he is the starter, is a starting caliber fantasy player. However, we don't know if he's going to be healthy or if he's going to be the starter. So the bottom line for this position for the 49ers is that as of right now, none of them are draftable in season-long leagues. If you're in Dynasty, go crazy. I think Lance and Purdy both have value in Dynasty leagues. In best ball, I think that maybe when we get more clarity on the situation, they're going to be a late round sleeper. I think right now, if you want to kind of make a bet on one of the two guys near the very end of your draft, I think that's a reasonable bet with a lot of upside. But there's definitely a whole lot of risk in a very wide range of outcomes with both 49ers quarterbacks. And like I said, if they name a starter, they're instantly going to be a fringe starter fantasy player and certainly a streaming option if they're on waivers in season-long fantasy leagues. All right, that does it for the quarterback position. Let's go ahead and switch it on over and talk about some running backs. So in 2022, Christian McCaffrey was acquired from the Carolina Panthers, which makes me sad. I love McCaffrey. I'm a Panthers fan. I love Christian McCaffrey. Wish him all the best. And he does look like he's going to be successful in San Fran. So good for him. Anyway, he finished 2022 as running back 2 overall and in fantasy points per game. Now, he was traded for prior to their Week 7 game against Kansas City. He was kind of used as a package player in that game. And then from Week 8 on, it was just full go Christian McCaffrey all day, every day. Now, on the full season, because it's really hard to look at all these numbers with splits, Christian McCaffrey ranked second in weighted opportunities among all running backs and in targets among all running backs, and then first in target share and receiving yards among all running backs. So basically, McCaffrey, in terms of his receiving load and his rushing load, when he was in Carolina, when he was in San Francisco, seeing a lot of total opportunity. Like, just that's numbers that you really want to see in fantasy football. Also worth noting that he did rank as running back 1 in total scoring from Week 7 to Week 18. And he ranked 3rd in total targets in that time frame. So basically, you're looking at a guy that when he was a 49er, he was the best running back in fantasy football. And he did it without having the highest receiving workload out of all the running backs. So that's another positive sign pointing to McCaffrey. Now, another positive sign is the fact that he had a very high floor thanks to being in this San Fran offense. He recorded 6 weekly top 10 finishes in 11 games in San Francisco. So just a guy that a lot of opportunity, solid floor, super high ceiling. Can't say enough about how good Christian McCaffrey was in fantasy last year. Now, what is worth noting, though, is that Elijah Mitchell, when he was active, had an effect on Christian McCaffrey. If you exclude the Week 18 game, because I think you can really just, for a lot of reasons, you can throw Week 18 out for a lot of teams. Christian McCaffrey and Elijah Mitchell shared a backfield for 3 weeks, Weeks 10, 11, and 12. In those 3 weeks, Elijah Mitchell led the team in rushing all 3 games, and he averaged only a 30% snap share. Well, roughly a 30% snap share for those 3 weeks. In those 3 games, Christian McCaffrey did not record a weekly top 10 finish and only averaged 14.7 fantasy points per game. So, if those numbers are to stay the same, then Elijah Mitchell is going to cut into McCaffrey's snap share. He's going to cut into his total number of opportunities, and he's going to cut into his fantasy production. However, McCaffrey, still a solid back, right? That like 14.7 fantasy points per game, that's not terrible. It's not bad. It's not what you're drafting Christian McCaffrey for, but it's not bad. And also, Elijah Mitchell's health is a big question mark as well. Elijah Mitchell's played 2 seasons in the NFL, and he's played 16 total games in 2 seasons. So it's not like Elijah Mitchell has a track record of sustaining that for 17 straight weeks. So while I do think that Elijah Mitchell being healthy could eat into Christian McCaffrey a little bit, I don't think that it's, I don't want to predict injuries, but I definitely don't predict there being that big of a workload for Elijah Mitchell for all 17 weeks. That's just the plainest way I can say that is I don't see Elijah Mitchell sustaining a snap share over 30% for 17 weeks. So the bottom line for the running back position is that Christian McCaffrey is the running back 1 in fantasy football for the foreseeable future. He's in good offense with a good offensive coordinator and good head coach with a good offensive line in front of him. And he's seeing plenty of opportunities from quarterbacks that don't necessarily throw it super deep down the field. So he's going to get work in the passing game, and he's great in the running game. Christian McCaffrey, elite running back in fantasy football. However, a healthy Elijah Mitchell could potentially cut a little bit into his workload and cut off a little bit of McCaffrey's ceiling performances. However, McCaffrey's total workload and use in the passing game still gives him a very high weekly floor. Mitchell, to me, remains nothing more than a handcuff option. I would not think that he's going to see enough of a snap share to be considered a starter or, a guy that you have to draft in season-long fantasy format. So heading into next season, Christian McCaffrey is my running back 1. Elijah Mitchell is my running back 47. All right, that does it for the running back position. Let's go ahead and talk about some wide receivers. So the wide receivers for the San Francisco 49ers were very different last year. Let's just use the word different, and I'll explain. So they targeted wide receivers at the 21st highest rate in the NFL. Makes sense because Christian McCaffrey got a lot of targets from the running back position. George Kittle got a lot of targets from the tight end position. Now, in terms of their finishes on the season, Deebo Samuel finished as wide receiver 38 overall and wide receiver 28 in fantasy points per game. Deebo Samuel was arguably one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy football last year when he was being drafted as the 3rd or 4th wide receiver off the board to only finish as wide receiver 38 overall. That's a big-time disappointment. Brandon Aiyuk was the guy that stole the show. He finished as wide receiver 15 overall and wide receiver 23 in fantasy points per game. Brandon Aiyuk kind of helped out a lot by the fact that he played all 17 games. Anyway, both Juwan Jennings and Ray McCloud were in the offense last year, and they both recorded 1 and only 1 weekly top 20 finish. So even when the 49ers went 11 personnel, that third receiver on the field, whether it was Jennings or McLeod, not a consistent fantasy option. So really, we're just talking about Samuel and Aiyuk. In target share last year, total target share, Deebo Samuel edged out Brandon Aiyuk 25.4% to 23.9%. This San Francisco 49ers were one of very few teams to have two receivers that were over 23% in target share. And so the fact that, both of them were over 23 and both of them were pretty close, I think that's actually a decent sign for both of them as fantasy prospects. However, there's more to the story than this. 49ers, you always got to look at their splits before McCaffrey and after McCaffrey, right? So Deebo Samuel's production dipped drastically after Christian McCaffrey was acquired, only averaging 11 fantasy points per game from week 7 on. He was not a top 30 wide receiver from week 7 to the end of the season. Deebo Samuel only had one weekly top 10 and two weekly top 20 finishes after acquiring Christian McCaffrey. Brandon Aiyuk had success both before and after McCaffrey. Aiyuk had two top 10 weekly finishes on the season, one of which was before McCaffrey was acquired, one of which was with McCaffrey, but without Samuel. So, moral of the story there, for Brandon Aiyuk to hit his ceiling, he needs either Samuel or McCaffrey to be out. For Samuel to hit his ceiling, he needs McCaffrey to be out. And I think that kind of tracks with what we know about Deebo Samuel. He's used as, this kind of gadget player where he can get the ball on jet sweeps, on screens, on checkdowns, these little underneath routes. And it's a little easier to get those to a running back than it is to get those to a wide receiver. So, not to mention Deebo also played running back in 2021. So I definitely think that it makes sense, knowing what we know about his play style, that his production dropped after they acquired a great pass catching running back in Christian McCaffrey. Now, Aiyuk, I think that he's a solid option, but I think that he's definitely at his best when he's not competing with Deebo Samuel for targets. Aiyuk, however, did have a higher weekly floor than Deebo Samuel. He did have 4 weekly top 20 finishes after McCaffrey was acquired. Now, I do think that with these 49ers receivers, looking at their historical production can kind of give you some insight in terms of what to expect this year. In 2020, Brandon Aiyuk averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game, which would have been good for wide receiver 18. He then dipped to 10 fantasy points per game in 2021 before bouncing back to 13.4 in 2022. Some of you guys might see where I'm going with this. In 2020, Deebo Samuel only averaged 11.5 fantasy points per game. In 2021, he had a career year, averaging 21.2 fantasy points per game and finishing as wide receiver 3 overall. And then last year, Samuel averaged 13 fantasy points per game. So here's where I'm going with this. If you were keeping track of all those numbers, these two 49ers receivers averaged about 28 fantasy points per game for the season in the last 3 years. Aiyuk went from 15 to 10 to 13. Samuel went from 11.5 to 21 to 13. So ask yourself here, based off the track record, what is most likely to happen with these two guys? Well, I think it's very likely that both of them end in the 13 to 16 range again this season, and again totaling about 28 fantasy points per game this season. So the bottom line is, even with the uncertainties at the quarterback position, Deebo Samuel and Brandon Aiyuk are both starter caliber fantasy wide receivers. However, I think the gap between the two is less than consensus. When you look at their production, when Samuel raised his, Aiyuk's dropped. When Samuel dropped, Aiyuk went up. And over the course of 3 seasons, they've been doing this balancing act, right? So I think that it ends up being pretty balanced. I have Samuel ranked a little lower than consensus. I have Aiyuk ranked a little higher than consensus. I have Deebo Samuel as my wide receiver 24, and I have Brandon Aiyuk as my wide receiver 35. And I know that sounds low, but when you see the full list, it becomes very difficult to bump Brandon Aiyuk ahead of some of the guys. I believe I have him right now right behind Michael Pittman Jr., and those are two guys that I like, but it's kind of hard for the wide receiver position. It's just so crowded right now. There's so many guys that are good options that 35 is the number I ended at. But I would have no problem in a league right now if I was drafting Brandon Aiyuk to be my third wide receiver or my flex, specifically in best ball leagues. I think Aiyuk is a great target in best ball leagues. All right, that does it for the wide receiver position. So let's go ahead and switch on over and talk about the 49ers tight ends. So George Kittle is the San Francisco 49ers starting tight end, and he had a career year last year, finishing as tight end 3 overall and tight end 2 in fantasy points per game. He recorded 6 weekly top 5 finishes, displaying a super high ceiling, and was a great DFS option throughout the season. However, he also had a pretty low floor. Because while he had 6 top 5 weekly finishes, he only had 7 top 10. So in other words, he had 6 and then 1 that was in the 5 to 10 range. And then the other weeks he was not in the top 10. Now, here's where I'm a little bit concerned about Kittle. There's a lot of red flags on Kittle's profile from last season, as good as it was. Kittle ranked 10th among all tight ends in total targets, 6th among all tight ends in target share, and 10th in air yards. Those are all less than his finish last season. That's a little bit of a red flag. He also scored 11 touchdowns, which was a career high by 5. He had never totaled more than 6 in a season. That number was second among all tight ends to Travis Kelce, which meant that he only ranked 10th in expected fantasy points per game. So when you calculate in the touchdown regression along with the lack of volume in terms of targets, target share, and air yards, he goes from tight end 3 to tight end 10 in expected fantasy points per game. Another red flag is that Kittle did a lot of his damage while Deebo Samuel was missing time. In the 3 games that Deebo Samuel missed last season, George Kittle finished as tight end 1, tight end 3, and tight end 12 in those 3 games, when in that span, he averaged a staggering 22.5 fantasy points per game. So bottom line is Kittle was great last year, but it was great with red flags. It was kind of, I don't want to use the word fluky, but it was a very fortunate season for Kittle that he found the end zone as many times that he did, and that he had those games with Deebo Samuel out where he really capitalized on those extra targets and those extra work. So the bottom line for George Kittle heading into next season is I expect him to regress to the mean slightly from his touchdown-dependent season last year and the injury dependency on Deebo Samuel that he exhibited last year. So basically, with that being said, he has a narrower path to tight end 1 than a lot of his peers, than a lot of guys that he's currently being drafted around. However, the tight end position is so mediocre right now, and the fact that he is, even if you factor in that regression, he is still a solid option. I still have him ranking out as my tight end 5. I have him right behind Darren Waller, and I have him right ahead of Kyle Pitts heading into next season. All right, that does it for the 49ers 2023 Fantasy Football Team Preview. So if you like what you heard, whether you're listening to the podcast form and you can rate and review, or if you're watching it on YouTube, you can hit the like button and you can subscribe. You'll be notified when new episodes drop. If you're listening to the podcast, you can subscribe there as well. You'll be notified when those new episodes drop, like our next preview, which is going to be the Seattle Seahawks. You'll also get notifications for our weekly golf content and our college football content that is going to be coming your way on this channel. Now, I mentioned Best Ball a few times on this show. If you are a first-time user on Underdog, I highly recommend using them for Best Ball. Use my code MConley88. You'll get your first deposit matched up to $100. Also, if you like my rankings, you like my write-ups, you like all the facts that I had for the players, they're all available on my Patreon, patreon.com/MikesMoneyPicks. It's $3 a month. It's much cheaper than buying a magazine or subscribing to a lot of other premium sites. You can pay your $3, get the ranks, get the draft guide, get prepared for your draft, and then unsubscribe if you want to, but they are all available on there. All right, that does it for this episode, guys. Thank you guys for watching or listening. Hopefully I was able to give you guys some good information to help you guys win your redraft, dynasty, or best ball leagues this year. Thank you guys, and I will see you next time.